So,
Awesome. That's great.
so why don't you give yourself a little introduction here? Let's talk about who you are, a little bit of your story. Just yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am currently I have a very German-esque title. Look at some German professors and they have like these massive titles attached to their names. And I somehow got one attached to mine. I think it's hilarious. I am not only an associate professor of theology and philosophy at Carroll College, I'm also the Archbishop Raymond G. Hunthausen Professor of Peace and Justice. And I bring peace with a sword and justice with a shield.
So
I'm
what does
kidding.
that mean? What sort of classes do you teach in that?
It's not a set of classes. It's more how you're going to dedicate your research, how you're going to
Mm.
draw students into research. It's named after a famous bishop in the Catholic Church, Bishop Raymond Hunthausen. He was the president of Carroll. He was the bishop of Helena, and then he was the archbishop of the diocese of basically Seattle. And
Gotcha.
he got in trouble in, what is it, the 80s or the 90s during the height of the Cold War. It must have been the 80s then, because he withheld half his federal income taxes due to nuclear power or nuclear missile the submarines coming into the docks at Seattle. He thought we were on the brink of destruction. He thought it was contra the message of Christ, so he withheld half his federal income taxes.
Wow.
Got in a lot of trouble both from Pope John Paul II and the government, but he always stood by his principles of putting people first. So he's a big symbol for this notion of what it means to be peace, and that, he brings a good sense of what I'd call Montana hospitality wherever he goes. So
Good. Yeah, that's a really incredible story. We don't have enough of those people living today.
yeah, he's an amazing guy. He and his brother live in Helena still. Got to talk with them, and they're hilarious. I know it's not about him, but he told me this really funny story when he was the president of Carroll, or he was at least teaching there, football coach or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But he heard some noise outside the window, looks outside, and there's someone pulling a 6-pack of beer up with the string. And as it got to his window, he took a beer out of it and just went back inside. And I thought that was really telling as to who he is. So he's a good guy.
That's good.
More about me. I am a sometimes happy father of two. Any parent out there will know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
Mostly joyous. I have a beautiful wife, a lovely dog, and 2 cats, and we live right up against public land here in Montana, which is amazing. So we get to go out and we get to wrestle bears whenever we feel like it.
Awesome.
But my story is, my family for the most part was my mom grew up Catholic, left the Catholic Church when she was young because frankly she got beaten by nuns. Can't blame her, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My father was the son of sort of an itinerant early evangelical preacher throughout Montana area. I grew up in the auspices of what you might call the deep Pentecostal church, and we were sort of half-hearted members for a long time, and I became an official member of sort of the Assemblies of God when I was 15. I had lost my father in an untimely manner, and this church offered a great and deep amount of love to me. So I was a part of that church for the next 7 or 8 years of my life. With the emphasis on spirit and the affirmation of what I'd called sort of standard fare evangelical theology, aside from the affirmation of spirit and spiritual giftings and whatnot, a lot of questions arose for me during that time. And you could say I've spent the rest of my life trying to sift the chaff from the wheat and try to understand what it means to talk about God, what we mean by that concept, where we think it directs our lives, and how we refrain, if you will, from falling into certain cultural traps that I think we've been bound to for 400, 500 years now.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great introduction to the first chapter of the book. And so one of the first points you really make is the difference between the God of reason and the God of relation.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So a lot of this book is actually based off of what I think is the right insight of Pope Benedict. Sorry for those of you who aren't Catholic. I do reference Catholic thinkers, just kind of how I'm rolling these days. So take it as
I have great appreciation for the Catholic tradition.
Cool.
Yeah,
good.
My godmother is Roman Catholic, and she's one of the most wonderful people I know.
Awesome.
So
awesome. That's great. Pope Benedict has this great quote in his Introduction to Christianity where he says, the early church had basically a choice. It experienced whatever it meant to experience the divine in Christ and in the life, death, and resurrection of this man. And it had to make a choice then as to how to interpret the God to which this divinity is attached. So it could go the route of the city gods and like attach Christ to someone like Zeus, becomes the sort of the incarnate Zeus. I'm trying to think of what the right avatar of Zeus maybe would be the right word, or avatar of some other Greek god. Or it could reach back into the Greco-intellectual tradition, into people like Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonists, and it opted for that second move. And it opted for that second move because the God of reason is indistinct from what we might call truth with a capital T. It is the source of order and the source of intelligibility in the world. And really, in some ways, that's the most you can say about this without incorporating, I mean, you can say a little bit more, parcel those out, but that's the most you can say about such a God without incorporating some other categories. But that's not good enough from a Christian perspective. When you're talking Christianly about God, you're not just talking about the one who creates and orders the world in some impersonal way. You're talking about the one who immerses himself into the world so as to draw it back, as I would argue, into what it's supposed to be. So this becomes the Christian reinterpretation of the Greco-Roman notion of God through Christ. All of a sudden, the God who was distant, who merely thought about the best possible things, which is God, now thinks about that which is lower than God's self, us, and draws us into God's self.
What does the Jewish tradition have to say about this, or what part of the Jewish tradition are we drawing on here?
Yeah, I still struggle with that in some ways. I think Christ himself is a manifest unfolding of the Jewish tradition. But if you're talking about in terms of the concept of God, I don't think there's any one particular Jewish concept of God, if you will. There's a Deuteronomist notion of God whereby there's this covenantal set of relationships. You fulfill your end, God will fulfill God's end, even if with infinite patience. There's the prophetic concept of God that if you will, sees, or a lot of the prophets see these sort of religious rights as secondary to the pushes for justice. For instance, Amos let justice roll. And then even in the first two creation accounts, you have, it seems to me, two different, I won't even say concepts, but two different manifestations of God. One who sort of sits distantly above the earth, creating it and ordering it, separating it like a good king would send out vice regents to separate the world. And the other one who immerses himself into it and breathes into the very dust itself to create his image in Adam and Eve.
So we're dealing... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, sorry. Let me finish up. Christ becomes, I think, the very Jewish part of this, because he is, at least as a Christian has to read Christ, he is the fulcrum and completion point of the Jewish tradition and what it would mean to absorb that God. So I'll leave it at that.
So in this creation story, in these two different aspects of God, we're really talking about, I think, two different doctrines of creation. Right? We've got creatio ex nihilo, and then the creatio ex Deus, or de Deus.
Sure.
So creation from nothing and creation from God. So which one do we follow? What do we think? Because if this creation, if this God is at the same time just fully above and fully beyond, but also completely immersed in the world, I'm just trying to figure out how, from the very beginnings of our faith, how we need to think about God.
That's always a tough question when we talk the beginnings of our faith, because that's a very personal question, in the sense that each of us have different beginnings. So one person may need to see a more distant God, if you will, someone who's gone through great suffering, maybe, or depending on their personality. Another may need to see the God who is intimately with us.
Doesn't that make God relational? Doesn't that make God sort of subjective to us, which I have issues with?
Well, I would argue that our relationship with God is in some ways God is not subjective. God is.
Right.
But where we stand in relationship to God, how we there's this important category in Aristotle. It's called phronesis. And the notion of phronesis is one of practical wisdom. So we have these great principles that we can come to rationally, that we can think through, but then we need to learn how to interpret these principles in the moment. Sometimes they'll unfold better, sometimes they'll unfold worse.
Right.
It's actually not that different when we begin with God. We begin with God where we're at least in a Christian sense. If you're doing a purely academic appropriation, that might be totally different. But in a Christian sense, we begin with the question of where we're at. And then we should always be seeking, if you will, a full appropriation of the notion of God, but we may have to begin at different places. After all, when we learn through time, chronologically, and it may be wiser to begin with certain ideas than others. So, let me put it this way. In Genesis, I think we are presented with a full notion of God in these first two creation stories. And both are affirming ideas that we have to, if you will, metaphorically affirm at a personal level that unfolds intellectually in a more full and conceptual version of God. So they're two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
You don't have the God who is, if you will, with us without the God who is entirely distinct from us. It doesn't seem from this Judeo-Christian tradition. So you have the God.
Putting it, yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. I'm going with this.
No. I thought that was very good. And this is something that we'll talk more about when we begin with David Bentley Hart's book, because this is one of the fundamental issues that he deals with.
That's right.
But anyways, back to your text. We're still in chapter 1. But you make several points about a culture that is not religious, about families being semi-religious and stuff like that. So what is that? How do you think our modern culture plays into our concept of God? That's a big. I know it's a big question, but if we can just sort of try and get at it a little bit.
Hold on, I got to plug it up. I'm gonna have to turn these off. They're running out of battery. Sorry.
No worries. Take your time.
Just do this real quick.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
So, how does our culture? Say that again. I like the way you asked that.
How does our modern culture influence our concepts of God?
Good.
It's sort of a. I was talking a few days ago with Bishop Will Williman of the Methodist Church, and we were talking a little bit about this, and about how our late capitalist culture has sort of made us numb to the idea of death, and how that's changed our notions of God. and how we interact with God. So something sort of in that vein. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts there?
So let's talk both immediate and let's talk long term, okay?
Okay.
Because we have some immediate ideas that we could start bringing up. I mean, we're told constantly, we have shoved down our throat one idea of God. I'll eventually come to it in the book, is what we call Jersey Shore God.
Right. Yeah, we'll get to that later today.
Yeah. We start with it as the concept of God as a cosmic vending machine, who, if you say the right incantations to and utter the right words, will save you from his own wrath, giving it instead, of course, to his son, and allow you to enter paradise. I don't know, maybe you get 13 virgins. I don't know how it works. But I got myself in trouble there, I think.
A little bit.
I think we've created God into a cosmic vending machine, right? So we just approach God as sort of a giver of things. We try to cajole God, coax God into serving us, much in the same way that the sort of ancient peoples in many ways have. And that, frankly, people like Plato and Aristotle and these other philosophers were trying to overcome. So I think that's one of the biggest ways that we make a mistake. And this comes from both a, if you will, quote unquote theistic side, and I say quote because I don't think it's true theism, as well as coming from the atheistic side, because you approach the Dawkins, you approach some of the new atheists, and you say, but they present to you who God is and who the believer is. God is the angry one in the sky who can throw lightning bolts at you, and who, if you say again these right words, will bless you, right? And it's the source of war, mischief, and all bad things in the world for the new atheists. And frankly, it's not a bad unfolding of what we oftentimes mean culturally by God. But then you approach them with the idea that actually that's not what we mean, though, in the tradition. It's not what the ancient sense of God is. It's not how God is not, for instance, merely a being amongst other beings. This is a good sort of a Catholic way of talking here that I don't think is reducible to Catholicism. But God isn't a person. God is personal, but God isn't a person in the sense of being an object among other objects. Here's a paperclip that I'm holding up. Here's a cup. Philosophers always go to cups, right? These are objects in the room. God is not an object in the room, but the source that allows any of these objects to be, including you, me, and the relationships that exist between us. So God isn't a being. God is the very active being that allows all things to emerge in their existence, right? That's a very different concept. That's Miyagi God, by the way. That's a very different concept of God than how we usually think through it. So culturally, what do we do to it? We turn God into a super muscular, I always pictured sort of the Sistine Chapel, right? This super muscular, shredded old man river who could totally beat you in a leg wrestling match in the sky. And I think that just is disastrous in terms of what we mean by God.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. And to put that all pretty much succinctly, it goes back very much to the burning bush passage that you cite later. That God is simply.
I think so. Yeah.
And that's sort of philosophers have dealt with that question for a long time about whether something can exist that simply is. And for Plato, it was the one. For us, it's God. But modern culture, modern philosophy, especially in the 20th century, tried to move away from that a lot, especially a lot of post-Kantians, people reading the theism or the theology out of these ancient philosophers. But that's a lot of the times due to misconceptions of what God is.
I think so. I mean, yeah, and this is the long-term cause. Look, I can confess this. My church screwed up in the Middle Ages, right? I probably we've gone through a recent sex abuse scandal that has rocked this church to its core, and rightly so.
Right.
But at the time, a character emerged by the name of Luther, and he didn't stand alone. There were many others who were also like him. They saw the corrupt. Exactly. And so, the theism that I'm talking about began to get interpreted by way of some Catholic thinkers in and through Christ as a sort of, what would you call it? They get interpreted through Anselm in a sort of tit-for-tat manner, in the sense that you have to merit your way into the heavenly realm. And those merits, if you will, can be bought and purchased via these avenues, right? So then you have
indulgences, right?
Exactly, indulgences. You then have the Reformation that's not based only on these indulgences, but a deeper and broader corruption that gets dealt with to a larger degree in the Counter-Reformation. But Luther, when he looks at the tradition, he thinks what is manifestly wrong with it, among other things, is it's what you would call its notion of justification.
Right.
So for the Catholic, justification means this: there is an internal transformation whereby you are becoming more Christ-like. Now that was interpreted, and there are ways to reinterpret that Protestantly, by the way.
Right. Yeah. Obviously.
That meant, for instance, a legal jargon in the Middle Ages, whereby you bought these indulgences and you were therefore transformed in the same way that the Eucharist sort of transforms you. St. Ignatius of Loyola said, no, this is a spiritual transformation whereby we have to seek spiritual perfection. But Luther is saying, no, you aren't seeking spiritual perfection. That would mean that you are seeking your own salvation. That's ridiculous. When I go to confession and I see the sin that I manifest in, I can't save myself. And so Luther says, no, there's this notion of justification whereby God sees you, you're the dung heap that you are, and God puts a silken blanket over you, right? Or some sort of beautiful blanket.
Which is Christ.
Which is Christ, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is Christ. But it's actually important. Now, we're totally nerding out here, but I think this is really important. Yeah. You see, Luther's concept of justification depends on a very specific concept of God, just as the Catholic concept of justification depends on a very specific justification of God, at least when the Catholic concept is rightly interpreted.
Right.
For Luther, he was affirming, in some ways, the voluntarist God, or the God that I call Jersey Shore in this book. God is not bound by nature. God is not bound by anything. God's will is not bound by anything but God's will. So God can do whatever it is that God wills. That's why Luther, by the way, is absolutely terrified of any other vision of God except for the one found underneath that of the cross, because any other vision of God is one whereby God is totally and completely unpredictable, and it's only in and through the cross and the remembrance of our baptism and the continuation of the seeking of Eucharist that we find a God whom we can confide in, right?
Right. And so that's the Christian problem, is that it's only that God is really, I mean, not entirely, but Luther was right in that, like, the only way for us to interpret God is through the cross. For our God to be intelligible is through Christ and through the cross.
I ultimately agree with that. I go hyper-Parthian.
I mean, he went about it the wrong way, but
yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, like that. God becomes meaningless without the cross. I do affirm that absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So Luther develops Luther latches on to a late medieval notion of God called the voluntarist concept of God. God can do anything. This to be contraposed to the previous concept of God, whereby God is the God of nature in certain ways. Nature is a direct expression of God and who God is. And we can see, if you will, the handiwork of God in nature. And indeed, God can't simply change nature. I mean, there are going to be arguments about this. Aquinas argues by way of what's called secondary causes. But God simply cannot change nature for the sake of changing nature, because it's already a good expression of who God is, right?
Because that's what he declared it in the beginning.
Exactly. And this is how Catholics came to interpret justification as well. There had to be an internal justification in and through our very nature and our seeking of it to indeed find salvation, combined with Eucharist, right? Mm-hmm. So we have now these two different concepts of God that have emerged, both of which we could also go through in terms of the notions of knowledge, but that Jersey Shore concept of God becomes the God that we've latched onto, in some ways corrupted, by the way. I am talking about a corrupted version of Jersey Shore. I disagree with Luther on this point.
Right.
But he also doesn't have as corrupt a notion of this Jersey Shore notion of God that we're discussing. Mm-hmm. This God highly depends on revelation. Again, we come back to the cross. We're terrified of God except for in light of the cross. Well, now you get a group of British empiricists emerging in and through the Enlightenment, or there are any number of Enlightenment thinkers who are saying, yeah, but I look out at nature and it's ordered. And it's not merely, if you will, some chaotic thing whereby God is exacting revenge around every corner. After all, Benjamin Franklin can build a lightning rod and harness not only the power of lightning and through electricity, but prevent it from burning down buildings, right? So there's an order to nature. Now emerges what I call the deist, or what I call in my book, the retired Oprah God, or the deist conception of God. Right. And this has actually become the God, if you will, that we have associated with classical theism. It's become the God that we think through in many ways when we discuss the notion of God at all. And and what it's done is it has we've taken the combination of deism and Jersey Shore, we've turned God into a huge man in the sky with sweet lightning bolts. But at the same time, one that we can manipulate, one that isn't bound, if you will, to the laws of nature, and out comes the modern concept of God that we've ruined.
Which is two points to that. That's hard to reconcile with, actually 3 points. The first one is that's hard to reconcile with a much more orthodox notion of impassibility.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Second, it's hard to reconcile with the idea that God is ultimately and in his fullness good.
Yep, that's right.
Right. And that's Luther struggled with that a lot. Luther, I don't think, ever conceived of God as good except through the cross.
Good. Absolutely. Yeah. God could be identified with a demon, he says.
Right. And which is like so hard to conceive for us. I guess as modern day thinkers, it's hard.
Yeah, it is.
And the third point, this goes back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about the different doctrines of justification. Mm-hmm. But they both go back to readings of Paul mm-hmm. and other New Testament epistles. And Luther sort of took this very Pauline direct. This has to mean justification by faith and faith alone.
Yep.
But then, you juxtapose that with the letter of James, and
sure.
You're like, well, what are we supposed to do now? But they're not mutually exclusive.
No.
Right? Yeah. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe all three of those points. So impassibility, God's nature as good, and reconciling those two doctrines.
So impassibility in the classical sense means this. God is eternality. God isn't in the eternal, right? So eternality isn't some space separate from God. God's is eternality. Mm-hmm. And so whatever we say of God, including, frankly, of the cross, and I think this is something that Catholics have struggled with in certain ways, we're saying that God has been this of and since and for eternity, such that God has never been something other than For instance, the God who comes to us on the cross.
Right.
So divine impassibility means that as we exist in time in a series of chronological events, God, if you will, is in a constant mode of creation, such that God doesn't, if you will, gosh, this is so hard to explain. God doesn't create, if you will, each of these events or see them unfold chronologically, but sees the whole unfolding of creation in and through the eternal moment, which he is always upholding and subsisting. There you go. Happy birthday. Go with it. Go.
No, that's it. I mean, that's about as well as anybody can put the doctrine of impassibility.
It's really,
yeah, it's a really tough one to grapple with.
Yeah, no, it is. And in some ways, like, so what voluntarism does, and voluntarist God does, whether it affirms eternity or the eternality of God or not, well, in any strict intellectual sense, it certainly affirms, if you will, like Calvin is going to argue for, God is a will willing itself. That's how Calvin argues for God in Institutes. And what he means by that is that God is faithful in all things. So God wills to be a God for us and will therefore never change God's will in this. Now, Luther doesn't have exactly that same idea, right? God is Luther's terrified of God, way more so, and maybe even rightly so in some ways than Calvin is. So eternality and impassibility doesn't come to be an impassibility of God's substance and nature, for lack of a better term, but rather of God's will and relationship to us.
Right.
And then deism, can you affirm impassibility from a deistic sense, other than we say that why would God want to be anything other than who God is?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a good question.
Well, I'll think about that.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be my dissertation someday.
Yeah, do it. I mean,
yeah. So just to summarize that a little bit, the doctrine of impassibility isn't really about the substance of God per se, and more about God's relation to us.
I'd argue for both, right? So in that God is, it depends on what you mean by substance. If you mean by substance an object among other objects,
because we can't really speak about God in terms of substance. But it's like the only grammar that we really...
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, we don't call... If I say it's factual that God exists, in strict terms, that's actually kind of contradictory, because what we mean by facts are cups and paper clips and phones and you and me and things in the world, right? And God's not a thing in the world. God is the very source of all these things, but that's just the way we speak.
Right.
So, so let's put it this way. For the classical theist, God couldn't just be a will willing itself. God has to be also an intellect, because at the base of everything is intellect.
Right. That's the God of reason that you...
That's the God of reason that I bring up in this book, right? Here, let me give a quick demonstration of what I mean by that, right?
Okay.
So when I talked about a cup, should we go back to the cup?
Let's do it.
We have to. When I talk about a cup, I'm not talking about some material substance per se. There's that too, but that's actually a secondary aspect of what a cup is. Right. Because what I mean when I talk about a cup is the definition of the cup. And we define what we would call artifacts or human-made things by way of their function, right? So the point of the cup, or the definition of the cup, is to be drunk out of. Well, not sometimes it's to get drunk out.
Right. No, the essence of the cup is in the act itself. Like
exactly. Yeah.
The drinking of the cup, that is when the cup is most itself.
Sure. That's right. And so what this means is that the definition has priority in its reality over the materiality of things. We could get into all sorts of technical discussions between Plato and Aristotle, but all of them are going to affirm that, if you will, order comes before chaos. Material is, if you will, chaotic and to be ordered, and that the definition and the form of something creates the substance of what it is. What we would say from a Platonic perspective then is that there is a universal cup in each of these cups, and God is the universal of all universals, drawing together the order and unity of this world, such that we can not only know the cup, but we can also drink from the cup.
Right.
This is getting strangely Eucharistic right now.
Also, this is way more of a metaphysics discussion than I ever thought we were getting into.
Yeah, sorry, man.
No worries. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it.
I think it's important, even if it's confusing and difficult, we got to jump back into these things, even if people want to say, "Yeah, could you shut up now that you're full of crap?" I'm fine with that. Yeah. But that's the impassibility then of this God. God is an intellect thinking through God's self, and in that act of thought, creating the world. Right. Mm-hmm. The world in classical Greek thought emanates from God, so it's a sort of an automatic emanation. We affirm as Christians that God freely and willingly creates. This gets into difficult issues, but that's fine. Always does. But Calvin is saying that God from the intellectual perspective is bound to God's self and God's intellect and how God thinks through these things in order to create them. Calvin's saying, that crap doesn't matter. God could have created any infinite number of universes if God so desired. But what we can count on with the constancy of God is not that God is who God is in any substantive metaphysical sense, but rather God will be for us whom God says he will be for us, namely the one who comes to us on the cross.
Right.
So does that help to distinguish those two?
Yeah, it does.
Good.
In the interest of time,
let's
move a little bit forward. And by a little bit forward, I literally flipped the page, and I have another question for you.
Yeah,
let's talk a little bit about what is sort of colloquially called transaction theology.
Ooh, I've actually never heard this, so inform me, enlighten me.
Okay. Well, I'm sure you're familiar with it.
I think I'm already catching an idea of where you're going with this, but I want to hear you out.
Yeah. Basically, it's that. And this sort of goes against a lot of the message of the cross.
Yeah.
But if you do things, God will save you.
Yeah.
It is, or even with the cross, like Jesus is a payment for you.
Exactly.
And part of that is okay. We can work a little bit with that, but then we're reducing Jesus to like cash essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is a lot of what mainline Protestantism has been doing.
Catholicism has its own way of doing that. Don't worry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're all guilty of it because it's hard to speak about it without those terms.
I agree. Yeah.
And that's just part of our very economically driven, grammar and structure of our world. But there are problems with that. Right. And there are problems that deal with the very nature of God in that God simply, offers this for us as if there was any payment we could give him for salvation.
Yeah, right? That's right. Yeah.
So could you speak a little bit to that, maybe?
Yeah, I'd love to, actually. I mean, Anselm, transactional theology like this comes out of this medieval character named Anselm. Anselm is actually he's a bishop of Canterbury. He's actually a super sweet dude, apparently, known by the monks and his abbot as being a very kind and gentlemanly abbot, right?
Right.
But he has this transactional theology that in some way affirms the infinite justice of God has been upset in and through our sin. And this is impersonal, by the way. God has to be rebalanced in some ways. That's an improper way of expressing it, but it's some ways, and that can only be done in and through and by God. So, if you will, Christ comes to us as both God and human and repays the debt owed to God, rebalancing, if you will, the infinite justice of God in and through death on the cross, while at the same time taking that punishment in and of himself. So we have this sort of what's it called? Vicarious notion of salvation in and through Christ. Now, the biggest problem with this, actually, Anselm means it in one of the most beautiful possible ways, that God cares more for us than God cares for God's self. And so takes on this notion and does for us what we could never do for ourselves. Actually, I think Anselm's being quite awesome there. But where he...
but that's different than treating Jesus as a transaction.
I agree.
I
agree.
Go ahead.
The biggest problem that arises with any of this is, I would argue that we are always already in infinite debt to God if we want to talk in transactional terms. Doesn't matter if we exist in sin or if we're in this perfect state of the garden. We're already in a state of infinite debt to God in that we are contingent and God is not. So let's go back to that notion earlier. God is the very act of existing, so that we could say that God's identity is already caught up in God's existing. God cannot not be.
Right.
You and me? Well, I could take a walk down the street and be hit by this is Montana, hit by a snowplow, eaten by a bear, rammed by a big ram, right? Or perhaps run across someone who's a little bit too frivolous with their Second Amendment rights for my own good. This could happen to me here, right? I don't have to continue to be. There's nothing about me and who I am that this world demands. We're not that important. I also came into being. Our parents bumped uglies, for lack of better terms. I know, I'm sorry. It happened with all of us.
I know. You never want to think about that as like a 19-year-old.
I know. But you are the fruit of your father's loin.
Oh, God. You're killing me.
I know, I'm trying to. That's a good thing, right? This is our way of emulating.
Ultimately, yes.
The image isn't a good thing.
Right.
This is our way of emulating the divine, right? That we procreate chronologically in the same way that God always is by God's very essence. Why did we start talking that way again? I was trying to gross you out so much that
we were talking about transaction theology.
Yeah. So there's nothing we can do, even at the material level, to bring ourselves into existence. So we are infinitely dependent on God as the very act of existing for our very being, even in our sin, for instance. So it doesn't matter whether we're sinful or not sinful. We already exist, if you will, in an infinite debt to God for drawing us out of nothing and making us into something.
Right.
So we don't have to put that
out of the grace of himself, right? This is the goodness of God, is that he created from nothing this world that he loves so much.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. I mean, that's why I think, like, when we want to start talking sin, and we eventually will, we always have to, if you will, crosshatch sin with Christ, and we have to ask, well, what was the world supposed to be? What was it always supposed to have been, and what is it now? And then we can begin defining sin, because sin is, if you will, the harmos, we fall short of a world in which it was supposed to have been made.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so we're gonna take. We're like still on the first chapter of your book here. So
we've gone through the other chapters.
We're gonna take like five more minutes to get through the last few pages of this.
Sounds good.
The last few pages of the first chapter, and then we'll spend like the last 15 minutes of this, since we got on a little late, just running through each of the caricatures that you.
Yeah, sounds good. That's awesome.
Also, Jason has just entered the room and says hello.
Hey, Jason.
He's bringing me my charger.
Beautiful young man. Poke his face? Is he going to put his face on?
There he is.
My day is complete now.
Can you plug it in for me? Please?
Are you commanding Jason around?
No, I'm asking him. Out of his good graces.
The infinite debt?
That's it, yeah. I mean, I owe Jason so much already, so. Great. Okay. All right. Like I said, spend a few minutes just finishing up with this chapter.
Yeah.
So if you can put this succinctly,
Yeah.
which will be hard.
I'll try. I don't know if I can.
Right. No, I mean it's that's okay.
Yeah.
You say on page 11, I rejected their dismissal of the application of reason to God, taking up the question of God as an intellectual pursuit. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, why is it bad to conceive of God as not reason?
Good. So, looking for that quote here. I want to think through it for a second.
Page 11, like towards the bottom, in the middle of that second paragraph.
So for me, it was a matter, in some ways, this was already a religious application of God. This didn't mean leaving religiosity behind, but it meant seeing a more fulfilling notion of religion, right? So if you look at the way that I come to express it after this, I said, the God of reason became for me a flashlight in a dark room where I could earlier smell that someone was hiding a dead, rotting fish, maybe even several, but couldn't yet find it. No, without the light of the philosopher's God,
I love your imagery in this book, by the way.
I'd have no hope of ferreting out these smelly mackerels of falsehood, and I had zero chance of ever finding anything like truth about God. Luckily, I found myself a flashlight in philosophy. So here's what I was talking about in terms of why there's no one beginning point with God. The one who begins with God, say a Plato or say an Augustine, Augustine is probably the better term. Augustine begins with a very philosophical notion of God, and through his mother's prayers, if you will, at least that's what he proclaims, and if you will, in and by and through grace, especially of the beauty of creation, he is drawn into a religious notion of God bound up especially with Christ and a particular interpretation of Christ. Mm-hmm. But I was beginning in a very different place. I was beginning in a denomination that has traditionally, and this is not true anymore per se, but traditionally eschewed reason for the sake of feeling something to be right. And what I saw there was a power grab. And I saw that people were trying to abuse, maybe not really in any sort of strict sense, but keep me in line in and through the suppression of the notion of reason. And when I read these ancient philosophers and realized that there could not be any distinction between truth and truths, if you will, it was freeing for me. So in and through the pursuit of the God of reason, I also got to pursue truth. So I absconded from a previous world of being a young earth creationist, right?
Yeah.
Where I thought that I had to, because scripture said I had to believe that the earth was 5,000 years old, something like that. That doesn't mean that I have to buy into a purely chance sense of Darwinian evolution. I can't. I'm Christian. The whole thing is oriented toward Christ, but it redefined a way that I could, if you will, see truth in the world that I was supposed to ignore, while at the same time affirming these truths in a broader context. Yeah. So can you ignore the God of reason? I don't think you can ever ignore the God of reason. One should always see reason, at least from a Christian standpoint, as a grace that allows us, if you will, to critically analyze, ferret out, affirm, reject, some of the ideas that we're presented in the pulpit. Jason, hope you're still in the room, or elsewhere on a sort of weekly basis.
Right.
But also, like I argue later on in the book, it's not good enough. The God of reason doesn't come to us when we're suffering.
Right. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's just make one more point. Actually, two more points. One is a pitch to all of the people who are watching this who have asked me the question of whether or not I believe in evolution. It's just frustrating sometimes, because it's just a question we get all the time. Which is that like, yes, I can believe in evolution, but not in a strict Darwinian chance
Exactly.
sense.
Exactly.
Like, God had a role. God was the role.
Mhm.
But things evolved, right?
Yep.
Creation didn't happen in 7 24-hour days.
Yep, that's right.
It's a way of allegorizing it, a way
Exactly.
of making sure that we understand why we are in the place that we are.
Exactly.
Great. Okay. Just wanted to get that out of there.
No,
That's always in my system.
exactly
So I
right,
wanted like all the people watching this to hear that.
Yeah, well, we affirm as Christians, we affirm something that is inherently unaffirmable by way of Darwin, right? A first century Jew is the meaning and trajectory of the universe. I mean, you can't come to that, right, by way of Darwinian thought. And yet at the same time, it's really not hard to see the way of genetic mutation, how it functions.
Right.
But
Exactly. And the second point is right at the end of this chapter on the bottom of page 13. I just want you to speak for a hot second to because then we gotta run through these caricatures and wrap up. Run through why this book's Catholicity does not make it exclusive for Catholics, knowing that the definition of Catholic simply means universal.
Yeah, sure. And of course, I'm using Catholic here in a more specifically religious sense.
Right.
What I mean by the Catholicity here is this: that we are always in a sort of relationship of trying to reconcile a concept of God that we know with a biblical understanding of God through Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Catholics do that explicitly by saying, here's a God of reason, here is Christ, and we are trying to reconcile them openly and faithfully. I think everyone else does that as well. They just don't say it as openly. And so perhaps if there's something you can learn from at least parts of the Catholic tradition, it's how to do that openly and with a sort of critical eye as to how you're doing it. And that's why it's not exclusive at all. I can't tell you how to believe about Luther versus Ignatius of Loyola, right?
Right.
But you can at least be open and honest in your way of doing so.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Let's run through this. We're going to run through very quickly. And basically, I'm just going to ask you to describe each of them.
You got it.
If I have a specific question about it, I will chime in.
Sounds good.
So let's go first. The Mr. Miyagi God.
Yes.
God of classical theism. Give it to me straight.
Okay. First of all, I was going to make all these into MMA fighters. And then I realized that would exclude a huge portion of the audience.
Yeah.
No. Mr. Miyagi, since he is my all-time favorite movie character.
You made the right decision.
Miyagi God. Miyagi God is the God of intellect. He is imperturbable, cannot be moved, cannot be manipulated in any way. Miyagi God is the source of life, the one who is both intimately intertwined with creation while at the same time is at a distance and, if you will, not able to be mixed up with creation. How else do I describe Miyagi God? God is pure intellect, thought thinking through itself, and in that thinking creates a created order. And the defining characteristic here that I think is important for this book is that God is free not to do whatever God wants, but what God wants is always identical with who God is. So God only ever does what God is, which is the good.
Right. Good.
Okay. That's Miyagi God.
Okay. I will chime in with a question.
Yep.
There's something a little bit violent about this God.
How so? Tell me, because I mean it's built in some ways.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously in the metaphor,
Mr.
Miyagi does karate, right?
Yeah.
So there was I'm trying to find exactly where I wrote this note. But basically, what I'm remembering, I can't find it. What I'm remembering is something about basically almost reducing God to a utilitarian calculus of what is the least painful method. Right. So when we're talking about Miyagi, he only ever fights somebody, to not
Sure.
to have less people hurt. Right. He fights in the second movie, he fights the bad Cobra Kai dude. Right.
Yeah,
But
that's
only
right.
because he's about to beat up his, student.
I like
Right.
it.
So is there, and I don't know if maybe that's just a question of the metaphor that we're using, but it's hard, especially as a Methodist,
Yeah.
to think about God in any terms that are violent.
I know. I like it. Yes, I think it's a function of the metaphor and not of the concept, and yet the concept has also been used violently. So I think you're right to see it within the metaphor as well. In the concept, God is imperturbable in the sense that God doesn't and need not fight anyone or anything, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, in the metaphor, and I even used the metaphor in chapter 4 to say that as soon as any of the other gods critique this God, he can totally kick them in the face, right? And reverse all their attacks.
Right.
So yeah, blame that one more on me. I used the metaphor somewhat violently. But really what I was latching on to.
Right. There is that part that a lot of people read the Old Testament and they say, wow, this is a very violent, angered God.
Which is funny because it's the exact opposite that I'm trying to portray.
Right.
What I want people to latch onto with Miyagi is the imperturbability
Mhm.
and the fact that he is unshaken in all things and always standing, if you will, in a sort of emotionless or seemingly emotionless imperturbability that allows Daniel-san to become the person who he needs to be.
Great.
That's what I want people to see in this. But yeah, it's interesting. We'll have to talk about that.
Yeah, we can talk more about that later.
Yeah.
Maybe when we're in the later chapters, synthesizing these different conceptions.
We'll bring out violence also in the Bentley Hart book, and it's going to be a really, really important thing to talk about. So
yeah, great. Okay, the voluntarist God, the Jersey Shore God.
Okay, so if we had the God of intellect in the previous one, the God who could not do anything other than who God is, Jersey Shore and the late medievalists say, forget you. We don't need to bind God to God's self. God is an absolutely free will, and reason merely follows a will rather than a will following reason, if you will. And so God acts in the world, acts spontaneously, creates individual things rather than natures, and therefore has total and absolute control over the world and how it functions.
Mm-hmm.
So the main reason that early thinkers came up with this sense of God is that, again, we could go back to Luther and Luther's notion of justification, or we could simply talk about the miraculous. God is able to cause things to be in the world that previously weren't, for instance, or for which had no potentiality. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good. I didn't really have any questions on this one other than, I actually let me throw in one for the audience.
Yeah.
If God is ultimately good, and I think the voluntarist conception of God throws that away, can that be a functional part of him? In the voluntarist method, can God as ultimately good be a functional part of his being?
I think it's always goodness is always arbitrary in this sense. Of course, it is even in.
See, I think goodness isn't. I think the voluntarists see it as arbitrary, but I think goodness.
Oh, that's what I'm saying.
Okay. Sorry.
So let's put it this way: we can project goodness onto God in the classical Miyagi sense as well, but we'll have differing interpretations of what that goodness might come to mean, right? But in some ways, we're all seeking the truth of the good and through God, who is the good itself. With Jersey Shore, Goodness simply means this. So there's this famous question in the Euthyphro, where Euthyphro asks, or Socrates asks Euthyphro, are the gods good because they are bound to something higher to themselves, or do they simply make the good as to what they want it to be? And this is the same question that we're faced with in terms of Jersey Shore. Yeah, God is by definition good, but that's only because God is the strongest and the might makes right at the end of the day from this concept of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Retired Oprah God of deism.
Yep. People got tired of the revelatory claims of Christ, and especially the way that later Protestants came to use this in sort of power plays. They said, no, there's order in the world. God created an order, and God is no longer a part of that order. God split, but we have the handiwork of God through which we can see God, in and through the empirical sciences especially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think many people conflate this view of God with the impassibility.
Exactly.
Version of
God.
God.
They conflate it with classical theism. I agree.
Yeah. I think that's very dangerous for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we go to your grandparents' pantheon, what can we say very quickly in like 1 minute about a reconciliation or synthesis of these three visions? Or
so
can't?
Yeah. Deism. It's right. There is order in the world, and we can, even if we can't affirm God in and through the sciences, what we can. That's not a bad thing, by the way. For me, the sciences are only affirming a very specific notion of knowledge in the world.
Right.
What we can do is affirm orderliness, and that's never a bad thing. Draw that now into Jersey Shore. Jersey Shore rightly saw that there has to be incorporated something like freedom in God. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about classical theism, which is where I will ultimately go, you always have to do so with the sense that there is freedom in this God, but it becomes difficult to talk about what that freedom means. Freedom has to be defined within the character of God. In other words, yeah, this is going to get too complex too quickly here. So I'm going to stop there and say this instead. What Jersey Shore gives us is a very Christian notion in some ways of God, whereby we recognize that God is not merely a principle of knowledge, but a God who is for us. And the one who need not have come to us has scandalously, as Paul says, come to us in and through the cross to be with us. Yeah. That I think Jersey Shore has right. I harp on Jersey Shore, and yet it's right here.
Yeah. We'll get into this more into the deeper synthesis of these later on in the chapters. Sure. But also, I have to disagree with you on your mayo-tuna ratio.
Oh, dude, no.
Come on. Okay, I have bad experience with mayo.
Fair enough.
So I was on a service project one summer, and
not unrefrigerated mayo. Oh, dude.
No. It was no. Hear me out. I was dared to drink a packet of mayo in exchange for a soda from the vending machine that none of the kids, were allowed to shop from, right? I was like, oh, this is reasonable. It'll be like drinking ketchup or mustard. And it was disgusting. It was one of the worst experiences of my life.
That's hilarious.
I was sick for a good 30 minutes after.
That's awesome.
It was, so I'm always opting for less mayo.
That's great.
Okay. Anyways, we've got, I think, 2 more, if I'm correct, to get through. First, hippie aunt, God of process theology. So why don't we say first, what is process theology, and second, the hippie aunt in relation to that?
So process theology takes a sort of vision of the person and incorporates it into the universe. So just as we might say we have a soul or spirit, some sort of non-material part of us that helps to make us who we are, and that is sort of character building, etc., so too does the world. God is, if you will, the world soul. And just as the soul in us is defined by and relates to our body or the self, however we want to talk about it, so too is the world soul in relationship to this world. in some ways being altered by, now there's these claims, I think false ones, claims to having some sort of steadiness in the concept of God in this. And I think that process theologians need to just simply go full Buddhist, frankly, and do away with their false notion of truth. Trip Fuller, you hear me here.
I'm doing another series. I'm supposed to do another series with Tripp on the Jesus book.
Awesome. Tell him I said that. You remind him what I do not interpret his person with his miscalculated concept of God.
But
here's what
maybe I'll leave you. Maybe I'll leave you to tell him that.
Yeah, that's fine. I do all the time. And he thinks I'm entirely wrong, so no worries.
There we go. I'm sure we'll have fruitful debate then. I think I agree with you on a lot of this.
Fair enough. Here's what I think what I think process theologians are, there's a call and response between God and creation. What God is trying to do is call creation to its best possibilities in the same way that we try to enact ourselves in this world in our best possibilities. And so there's these moments of what process theologians call concrescence, whereby the whole world concretely forms into a unified whole. There are actually some process folks who said like a 30th of a nanosecond or something. I don't know how you come to that calculation, but it doesn't matter. That's not giving them due credit. Yeah, and in that, and then what God does, God offers the world possibilities. The world in return either takes up or rejects those possibilities, and there's this sort of constant unfolding of the world and God in relationship to the world in and through time. So it's an explicit rejection of the notion of divine impassibility for the sake of a real sense of freedom to the world. And it's trying to, in some ways, find and create meaning. Now, I use hippie ant as I used to see, especially with the W's in office, and I assume they're going to come back soon. I used to see a lot of drum circles on the corner where I lived when I was living in Seattle. And I always thought they were kind of hilarious, but I also got it because there seemed to be a real sense of camaraderie that emerged in and through them, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I see them around DC sometimes.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, there's part of you that wants to laugh at it, honestly, but there's another part of like, okay, fine, do it.
Yeah.
God is the leader of a drum circle, drawing all religions, all persons, all beings into, if you will, a unified rhythm. That is the metaphor that I use. And this is done through your crazy hippie ant, which just expresses many of the theologians and who they actually are right. In this tradition. So
great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, moving to the last one, Joan of Arc and the God of Hermeneutics. Sorry, I always mispronounce that word.
I know.
It's a tough one. Okay, so first, just tell us what hermeneutics is, what the God of Hermeneutics is, and why Joan of Arc provides a good example of that.
You got it. Hermeneutics, it's the way that we interpret our world. You applied it to books first, and when we took up hermeneutics, we said, what's the proper hermeneutic for interpreting this book? So we were looking for an interpretive principle by means of which to understand a book. But there are a lot of thinkers who realize, well, just like we do with text, we do with our lives as well. So we exist, if you will, in a narrative in our lives whereby we are constantly, as we do in a book, projecting a thesis, projecting a narrative, and then seeing if that thesis actually comes to light as we continue to live out our lives, right? Just as we continue to see whether in the Brothers Karamazov, Ivan is really an atheist or whether he's an atheist in disguise or something else, right?
Yeah. Great reference.
Thanks. Yeah, great book.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we
one of David Bentley Hart's favorites, by the way.
Oh, I know. I have a man crush on him. So.
I have just a regular crush on him.
Just a straight up crush, yeah, fair enough.
Crush, yeah, there we go.
Crush, yeah. So how do you say it? What's this do for us? Well, The God of Hermeneutics, if you will, it comes from Jersey Shore, but it's a corrective to Jersey Shore, especially interpreting God in and through this notion that God is love. And what this God does is it constantly interrupts the narrative of the world that we project, that we think is the case. So think of it this way. We always think that we're awesome. We always think we're really, really the most important things in the world. And what the God of Hermeneutics is the interruption in our lives that draws us out of ourselves and back to a Christ-centered life that learns to see the other as yourself. And I use Joan of Arc because I just tried to put myself in the experience of a soldier on a field in the Middle Ages. You don't expect to get stabbed and killed by, again, by own image, sorry, stabbed and killed by a teenage girl, right? And yet here she is overtaking your town, and all of a sudden, your world has been blown open. So is your gut, unfortunately, but your world's now been blown open. So the image of Joan of Arc is this: she defied all of our expectations, and she defies an expectation of what a peasant teenage French woman could be. And this, in many ways, is much like God. God is constantly defying and should defy our expectations of what, especially in love.
Yeah. No, good. I also just want to commend you on your use of female pronouns to describe God in several sections of this. I thought it was really good. I thought it because there are, one of the main descriptions of God in the Old Testament is wisdom, which
that's right. Yeah,
is a feminine noun.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wonderful. So glad we just barely made it through it. Oh, actually, I do. Just one concluding question.
Yeah.
It isn't really conclusive of our whole talk, but it is about Joan of Arc, or the God of Hermeneutics. I want you to answer the question of the acolyte on page 48.
Oh, let me look at that.
Does this mean God is more of a happening than a something? I thought it was an incredibly poignant question.
Yeah, and this, Tripp wrote all these, and he got to troll me throughout my entire book. Yeah, in fact, that's what God is for the hermeneutic God. God isn't something. Again, for hermeneutics, God isn't a being amongst other beings. And this they draw from that classical tradition. God is showing up, and they take especially seriously the idea that the only God that matters is a God that is for us. And the God that is for us shows up in our lives as an event, a happening that draws us beyond who we thought we were into who God calls us to be.
Great.
So
good. Great. Awesome. So that just about finishes us up for the day.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.
We will be back here next week. And just to let you know, we had 175 views on Facebook.
Cool. I hope you all enjoyed it. Sorry. I'll try to keep it less technical next week, but these God questions get into technical questions.
No, yeah, I know it's absolutely fair. That's sort of the point of this, is to deal with the technicalities,
cool.
to make it more, to make the technicalities more accessible.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, I think that's right.
Our congregations.
Awesome.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. We will be here next week, everyone. So
awesome. Thank you, David.
Eric, thank you for your time. We'll see you soon.
Awesome to talk to you.
You too.
Bye-bye.